kind of start our fireside chat here, I thought maybe we would...
Where's the fire? Where's the fire?
Right? Can't you feel it? Thought maybe we would go back to the year 1982. Not too far into the year because didn't exist quite yet.
No, you're not alone.
Let's start later in the year. But you were the manager of new pizza marketing for Pizza Hut. Is that correct?
Not too far from here, Wichita, Kansas.
Yeah,
I was working
that's
for
right.
about a year. So my job was to eat pizza. Pretty good gig.
Experiment with all the different toppings. There you go.
That was me.
So talk about, when you were thinking about your career at that point in time, what did you envision for yourself?
Well, in truth, I worked for Pizza Hut, which then was a division of PepsiCo for just a year, and before that, worked for Procter & Gamble in Cincinnati for just a little under 2 years. But they were at the time, I knew, or at least I felt, just little chapters. The story actually began a few years before that, actually when I was still in college in the late 70s, when I basically fell in love with the idea of the internet. I just believed that it would happen. I remember reading a book, I think it was 1979, by Alvin Toffler, called The Third Wave, and he talked about the idea of an electronic cottage and this new system that would allow people to interact with each other and get information and buy things and so forth. I was completely fascinated with it. And when he wrote the book, it was futuristic. It didn't exist. But I just became convinced it was going to happen. But when I graduated from college in 1980, there were no companies to go to do it, and the startup scene at the time was not something that was really conducive for me to do it on my own. It was different back then. So that's why I worked for P&G and then PepsiCo. But all the while, I was trying to figure out my angle. Even when I was in Wichita, I was working for Pizza Hut by day and kind of consulting with some companies by night, just trying to figure out how to break into this thing. And finally, in 1983, I moved to Washington, D.C. To join a little startup that was doing a product called GameLine. Back then, virtually nobody had personal computers, but a lot of people had Atari game machines, and I thought that would be the way to get into this, with a modem that plugged into the game machines. But I learned pretty quickly, the hard way, as many entrepreneurs I'm sure in this room have learned, that the startup path is not always a straight line, and that a few weeks after I joined the company, they laid off like 80% of the people. The only reason I don't think I got fired was I was the cheapest guy in that department, so they kept me. And that company struggled and ultimately did not succeed, but thankfully I met two people there, and the three of us started AOL in 1985, so 29 years ago. So the Wichita experience and even the Cincinnati experience was, to me, path to learn some things. I actually learned some interesting things at both companies that did help later on, but the dream got sparked before that with this idea of the internet.
Sure, that's fascinating. So kind of talking about that spark, were there others in your life that influenced you? Were your parents entrepreneurs? Did you see that sort of in the community that you grew up in? Or was it just sort of through your reading and sort of taking in all that knowledge?
No, it was the community. I grew up in Hawaii, which is actually not a great place to grow up, but not particularly conducive to risk-taking and
Native Hawaiian?
entrepreneurship. I'm not native. Both my parents were born there as well, so my family goes back in Hawaii over 100 years. But so in that sense, we're from Hawaii, but don't have Hawaiian blood, which is the definition of native Hawaiian, but certainly have a connection to Hawaii. But my father was a lawyer, worked for one law firm for 60 years. My mom was a teacher, and neither was particularly entrepreneurial, and neither was super enthusiastic when I was moving into this. They were quite proud of me, I think, when I was working for Procter & Gamble. They were slightly concerned, maybe more than slightly concerned, that I left that after 2 years, and probably somewhat more concerned, maybe baffled, that I went from Procter & Gamble to Pizza Hut. And then a year later, when I left that to move to the startup, which promptly failed, they really thought I'd gone off the rails.
Sure.
And I think early on I felt I didn't know what an entrepreneur was when I was a kid, but I kind of liked starting stuff and envisioning how things could be different and building businesses and making money and things like that as part of it. And so I always thought I'd do something more entrepreneurial, even though I went into some of these big companies to learn some things and to kind of bide my time while I figured out a way to kind of get going on this path of the internet.
Yeah, absolutely. So, talking about your time at AOL, those early days, when did you finally know, or what was that moment that you sort of realized that you were onto something?
Well, I would say I always believed we were onto something. I always believed that the internet, again, it seems obvious now, but when because of course the internet is pervasive, and many of you have grown up with it in a way that you're like digital natives, and it just, you think of the internet like you think of, electricity or water, it's just kind of taken for granted. But back in 1985 when we started, only 3% of people were online. And that 3% was online on average 1 hour a week. And so it was a struggle. It took us, to answer your question, it took us a decade before we really got traction. It was hard. I mean, there was a lot of structural reasons why it was not taking off. Even when we went public, we were the first internet company to go public in 1992. We've been at it for 7 years from the start of AOL. Actually, I'd been at it for 13, 14 years from the point I really decided this is something I want to do. And at that point in time, we'd been at it for that long, and we had 184,000 customers over that period of time. Now, that's the bad news. The good news, we were able to get public. We finally convinced people that someday this would be a bigger market, and 8 years later, we'd gone from 184,000 customers to like 25 million customers.
Yeah, sure.
But it took a while just to build that infrastructure. In retrospect, it's obvious why it took a while. As I said, most people didn't have PCs. The people that did have PCs didn't have modems. It was a peripheral device. You go to the peripheral section of a computer store back then to get this newfangled modem thing. It took us 4 years to convince PC manufacturers to build them in. We said, actually, we think in the long run, the main thing people will use the PCs for is to connect, which again seems obvious now. Didn't seem obvious then, and they were like, why would we add that when there's a cost to every computer when only like some subset really cared? The communications networks were $10 an hour. We had to get to 10 cents an hour. One of our partners, by the way, was Sprint, down the street here. The content wasn't that interesting, so if you actually went to the trouble of getting a PC and installing a modem and figuring out the communication software and signing up and were willing to pay, and could kind of figure out how to navigate. Actually wasn't much to do, nobody to talk to, and nothing to, the content was pretty minimal. So, in retrospect, there's a reason why it took a decade,
Sure.
and thankfully, our team and others working on it, stuck with it. I think one of the lessons for me about entrepreneurship, particularly if you're trying to do something revolutionary and change the world, and a lot are in education and healthcare and a lot of different sectors, revolutions often happen in evolutionary ways, and you've got to have the passion and perseverance to stick it out. And you also have to embrace the idea that you probably can't do it alone, that you probably need to kind of have a partnership strategy. AOL could not have been successful without our partnership with PC manufacturers like IBM and Apple and Tandy, and our communications companies like Sprint and GTE and others, and our content company. It was a tapestry of alliances that built AOL and overall built the
Sure.
internet. It wasn't just a company, and certainly wasn't just a few people at one company. And I think that's going to be more common in this next wave of companies.
Sure. And I think what I'm also hearing you say is that there's sort of looking back, hindsight's always 20/20, right? There's a lot of failing forward and learning what those are. And even with Silicon Parade News, we talk about that a lot, that they're not mistakes. We're always failing forward and learning from that. So kind of just through your experience, your entrepreneurial journey, and then we can talk about some of the things that you're looking at with Rise of the Rest. But I think all of us probably grew up on AOL. I personally learned how to type using Instant Messenger. But yet that's not the dominant sort of communication. You believed in social and community very early on,
Right.
and it's not dominant now. So what do you consider that a failure? Do you see, like, how would you describe that? And maybe what were some of those lessons that you learned?
Well,
through
I'd
that
say
journey?
two things. You were not alone in kind of using AOL as an on-ramp. At our peak, over half of all internet traffic in the U.S. went through AOL. Nor are you alone in using AIM and texting. And the first time I met Mark Zuckerberg, which was probably 6 or 7 years ago, I realized, first of all, that he wasn't even born when I first started this, kind of a little sobering. Sorry about that. Second is he basically said, I just want to let you know that, kind of apologized, but that I, when I was 11 or 12, learned how to program by hacking into the AIM system. And he told me the group, the hacker group he was part of, it actually was one of our...
Did you tell him you were welcome?
Yeah, I'm telling him I'm glad you got that off your chest, and now we can move on. But we always believed that the killer app for the internet, and certainly the killer app for AOL, was people. We called it community. Now people talked about social media or social. We always believed in that, so that was always our bias. Yes, we cared about content. Yes, we cared about commerce. Yes, we cared about connectivity. Yes, we cared about context, how we packaged everything. But the one we cared the most about, there are 5 C's. The most important one was community, and so we built instant messaging, and then AIM, and people connection, and forums, and a lot of things. And at the majority of AOL's traffic was always communications, always community. So it's not surprising to me that the dominant services today are Facebook and Twitter and Snapchat and others that are fundamentally about connecting people. I think that is remains the the killer app. The rise and then sadly the decline of AOL, I think the rise was based on a passionate belief by a team that was trying to change the world and playing the role of attacker, pushing. As AOL got larger, and certainly after it merged with Time Warner, it kind of slipped into the role of defender. And it was more protecting what it had as opposed to pushing. And that's pretty common with large companies, and that creates enormous opportunity for entrepreneurial companies. That there's a kind of a natural ebbing and flowing. I think there's going to be enormous opportunity in the next 10 or 20 years in areas of our lives that are pretty fundamental. Health, learning, transportation, energy, pretty fundamental parts of our lives, and pretty significant sectors of our economy that are going to undergo a lot of disruption. And for the most part, the incumbents are going to be defenders, and the entrepreneurs, the startups, are going to be the attackers. And that's going to create a lot of disruption and a lot of value.
Sure, yeah, and I think that's one of the things that's really special about some of our corporations here in the region. Even locally here, whether that's Sprint or whether that's Garmin, they're continually looking at how to reinvent themselves and disrupt their own sort of areas. So, all right, let's focus on Rise of the Rust a little bit. But in order to do that, I wanted to kind of take us back on a little bit of a history lesson and get your perspective on this. So, I love World War I history, and during that time, all of you who remember, in the early 1900s, the dominant GDP player was Great Britain. It was England. And they decided a lot of our fiscal policy, our social policy, and a lot of sort of the, I think, world challenges that we deal with today. Actually, you can trace those back to World War I. Fast forward, United States, we are now the largest GDP. But that doesn't mean that that's always going to remain.
Right.
If you look at the scale and time in which we did that, it seems long, it's actually a short period of time. Although China, half of our GDP, they also have a pretty critical scale. So talk to me a little bit about your perspective on what is the Rise of the Rust about, and is it sort of saying we want to maintain sort of our dominance?
Right.
Because if not, no longer, I think at times, our generation can take for granted the fact that we are a larger player and that we do have a primary voice. And if we don't actually start focusing on the part of the country, which, by the way, the middle part of the country produces over half of our country's GDP, we could really lose that advantage. So talk a little bit about your perspective.
That's exactly right. That really is the perspective. And going back even further in history, I think it's worth remembering that 250 years ago, America itself was just a startup. It was just an idea. And now, 250 years later, it's the leading economy and therefore kind of the leader of the world. I don't think that happened by accident. I think the history pretty clearly shows that it was innovative entrepreneurs, that really American entrepreneurs, that led the agricultural revolution, led the industrial revolution, and more recently led the digital revolution. That's why we are now the leader that we are. And I think as we sit here today, we remain the most innovative entrepreneurial nation. But as you say, there are a lot of countries around the world who are saying, hey, I get it. I get the secret sauce that sort of powered the American story is innovation, entrepreneurship. let's change our immigration policies, change our investment policies, change our research policies, change our regulatory policies, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, and try to shift that center of gravity to our country and away from the United States. I think there's a real risk of that. And I think the best way to deal with that is to make sure at a national level we do everything we can to prevail, and that includes reforming our immigration system so we win what is now a battle,
Sure.
global battle for talent. That includes changing some of the securities rules, which Congress did pass a couple of years ago, to update them after 80 years to allow things like using the internet for crowdfunding and make it easier for young companies to go public. And some of that relates to figuring out ways to make sure that the investments are appropriate in new sectors in terms of basic research. Some of it, there's a lot of different things we have to do at a national level. But we also have to recognize that while, and again, I'm like come out of the internet. People view me as a tech guy. So obviously I'm an advocate for the internet and an advocate for technology. But our economy is not just about technology, and it's also not just about Silicon Valley.
Right.
What's happening, as you said, more than half of the economy is in the middle of the country, yet 80% of venture capital goes to 3 states, California, Massachusetts, and New York. There's an imbalance that's not smart just from a public policy standpoint. You want to have a more evenly distributed system, but also not helpful to the entrepreneurs in places like Kansas City that really have great ideas and want to build those companies here, but it's just harder
Sure.
to raise the capital, therefore it's harder to get the talent, and there's harder to build the networks and so forth. So the idea of the Rise of the Rest is kind of animated by the idea of how do we make sure we remain the most innovative entrepreneurial nation, but then saying one way to do that is to support all entrepreneurs in all places, focused on all sectors, and sectors including agriculture, including food, including hospitality, including energy, including education. There's a lot of manufacturing, lots of parts of our economy that also are ripe for entrepreneurial disruption. Let's support those folks too, and let's recognize that some of those folks are in places where the media isn't paying attention and the investors aren't necessarily paying attention, and how do we promote these regions and support these entrepreneurs. And that's really what the Rise of the Rest effort's all about. We kicked it off in June with a road trip, and we used a bus because we figured that was like Americana and we'd get more media attention, and it's kind of worked out that way. Plus it's easier to get around the cities because we ended up making a lot of stops in each city. Started in Detroit, then went to Pittsburgh, then went to Cincinnati, then went to Nashville. This week we started in Madison, then went to Minneapolis, then Des Moines. Obviously we're here, and tomorrow we're in St. Louis. 9 great American cities
Sure.
with great histories, but more important, great futures because of what great entrepreneurs, including many in this room, are doing.
Sure, yeah, and I think, that's why we were so excited to partner with you guys on this, because it's our same premise as well, is that you're disrupting the geography around where you're having high growth entrepreneurship and being able to tell those stories. So
Right.
to your point about VC funding, if you also then look at media, you have like less than 2% of those stories coming out of this part of the country.
Right.
And so let's talk a little bit about the communities that you've been visiting and some of the others that you're referencing. We talk about community a lot, and when you're on the ground, you're probably visiting the co-working spaces, the accelerators, some of the resource partners who are on the ground. What makes a strong community? And then, and not only what makes a strong community, but do they become passé at some point? Do we evolve out of them? And so right now, in some of the communities that you just mentioned, you're going to see a lot of those resources on the ground really helping to support and sort of kickstart those communities. And if you take that 20-year perspective, where are we in 20 years?
Right.
Do we still see the same resources, or is it different?
No, I think in 20 years, hopefully even in 10 years, there'll be a broadening of our innovation economy, and it'll be spread more evenly across the country. I think that's what has to be, and I think inevitably it will be. Hopefully it'll be sooner rather than later. And all we're trying to do is accelerate a trend that we think will naturally happen, but it'd be better for the country if it happened a little sooner as opposed to
Sure.
later, and also better for more entrepreneurs if it happened a little sooner rather than a little later. In terms of the answer to the question about what builds a thriving startup community, I'd say I chair an organization called Up Global, which has Startup Weekend and Startup Week and Startup America and Startup Digest, a bunch of things, and Mark Nager, who's the CEO, is here. And we published 6 or 7 weeks ago a white paper, so if you go to the Up Global site and just search on Up Global's startup communities, you'll see this white paper. But there are basically 5 factors that we identified were the key ones, and the dynamics are a little different in each place, but the 5 factors are pretty consistent. One is talent. One is capital, one is density, one is culture, and one is regulations. Beyond the specifics, it's how you get all the stakeholders in a community doing what they can do to support startups and entrepreneurs, and then how do you get them to do it in a more networked, collaborative way? How do you create more network density, more of a increasing returns, more of a tipping point, more of an acceleration in each of these regions? So when we come to each of these cities, it's a mix of things. Obviously, it's the fun is to do the pitch competition, which we're going to do next with some of the most promising startups in each city, and shine a spotlight on some of the innovations happening in each city. But we also do a startup crawl, visiting different places. We're in the startup village today and met a bunch of different companies. And we also spend time with business leaders. And we had a breakfast. We spent time with government officials, with Senator Moran, and both mayors were with us this morning. And we spent time engaging foundations. Just came from a lunch at the Kauffman Foundation. We need to get all the stakeholders doing what they can to move the ball forward in support of the community and support of entrepreneurs, and then encourage them to do a little more and to do it a lot more collaboratively across those key 5 principles.
Sure. So what are your reflections or takeaways from these communities that you've seen? Even we're in a bi-state area, and even having the 2 mayors at a breakfast to talk is great. And we know that they've been great supporters and champions of what we've been doing. But just from the cities that you visited here, what are those takeaways? What have you seen that actually may be a little bit more telling, positive, but then areas that not are red flags, but are saying, hey, significant areas of opportunity here?
Well, I'd say the 9 cities are each have their differences. I can talk about some of the differences, but what unites them is probably more than what divides them. And one of the aspects is that there is a growing recognition in each city about the importance of startups to drive growth, create jobs, and support the community. I mean, ultimately, communities kind of rise and fall based on what's happening in the business sector, and that's the primary source of jobs, the primary source of growth, which is the primary source of taxes, which then help support the community. And the most visible example of when it's working well, it's great, and when it's working badly, it's terrible, is Detroit. Which, by the way, we focus a lot on Silicon Valley, and again, I love Silicon Valley, but it is worth pointing out that 50, 60 years ago, Silicon Valley was an orchard, and Detroit was effectively Silicon Valley. Detroit, half a century ago, was the most innovative city in the world, with the strongest economy. Why? Because the car was the technology of the day, and Detroit was rocking and rolling, and it was on fire. It lost its way. It lost its entrepreneurial mojo, global competition, complacency, all kinds of different factors you can point to. In the last 60 years, Detroit's lost 60% of its population and is now bankrupt. Now it's fighting its way back by reinvesting in startups, but that's a pretty searing story, and a reminder to every community that it's not, and you said this earlier in terms of even the Britain and the story, it's not always like this.
Sure.
And it's going to be like this unless you are constantly leaning into the future, constantly investing in the future, and that means backing entrepreneurs with the new fringy, crazy ideas, some of which will end up being the next big Fortune 500 companies in your community. In terms of the different say I mentioned what unites them, what's different about them is there usually is different dynamics, different centers of gravity. And for example, Pittsburgh, which 100 years ago, arguably Pittsburgh was Silicon Valley because it was the steel capital powering the Industrial Revolution. It lost some of its momentum. It's actually quite strong now, in part because of Carnegie Mellon, a great research university, and particularly robotics technology and a legacy of making stuff. It's a great manufacturing town, and so that's why that's really coming back. It's very university-led. Something like Cincinnati is being kind of rebuilt by the big companies there, the Fortune 500 companies like a P&G, saying, and it just happened the last 3 or 4 years, we need to be more coordinated in investing in the future of Cincinnati. They created an accelerator, they created a venture fund to invest in other funds, and they have a bunch of different activities going. So the corporate role there is actually pretty central. There's other places where the government kind of takes a a lead. And there's some places where it really is all hands on deck, particularly Detroit, partly because it is so bad. There's very strong entrepreneurial leadership by Dan Gilbert in the downtown area, an entrepreneur. Very strong leadership from the mayor and the governor because they have a crisis on their hands and are kind of doing everything they can to rebuild Detroit. Very strong participation of foundations like Kresge that are based there, basically built on the success of Kmart and based on outside of Detroit and investing heavily in it. Very involved, engaged university. So it's sort of like this all hands on deck approach. So the dynamics in each place are a little bit different,
sure.
But it requires everybody to do their part, and then particularly requires more collaboration, more networking across those different, and then it requires some patience. This thing takes 10, 20 years before you really get
sure.
Traction. You can't just have a quick project and after a year say, okay, kind of either worked or didn't work and move on. You got to be in it to win it over the long run.
Yeah, some persistence and perseverance, right?
Right.
So do you have any, so one of the things that we really focus on too, each city has its own dynamics, but then I think what one of the strengths is how do you connect our cities, sort of what you
right.
said. Have you seen good examples of communities, whether that's in the triangle, the Research Triangle area, whether that's in Ohio, Michigan, sort of those communities, here across Silicon Prairie, Omaha, Detroit, Kansas City, we really try to work to figure out how we connect,
right.
not only how we connect hyper locally, but then how those cities connect with one another. Have you seen good examples of how some of those conversations have been happening?
Yeah, I think they're different models in different cities, but the issue of networking and connections, which the Up Global thing both deals with culture and density, and is how do you create a sense of possibility. There actually are a lot of communities, and I'd argue Kansas City is among them, that tends to be kind of risk averse, tends to be kind of cautious. The current leaders of the larger businesses are not as aggressive. Obviously there are exceptions, but in general I think are not as pushing the envelope in terms of what's possible as much as they should be. Now I think that's changing. Some of the conversations even I had today suggest that's changing, but they're and in growing up in Hawaii, as I said, it's kind of risk averse too. It's kind of like more focused on protecting what's there and less focused on building what could be there. So some of that is that cultural dynamic, and some of it just getting building relationship, building trust, and getting people to understand the importance of this and work together in a synergistic, networked way, and then start having some successes, which then helps attract more local support, whether it be mentoring or capital or funding different initiatives, which then helps attract more talent, which then helps attract more capital, and then you kind of get this flywheel going. And you often see in fact in almost all the cities, talking to entrepreneurs, they talk about the problem accessing capital and at all stages. I think that will get better over time if there was more networking within the community and more telling the stories about the successes of the community. That would attract more attention from other places. And the other complaint is on the talent front. There's a lot of talent in places like Kansas City. Now, granted, some of it may be in some of the larger companies,
sure.
and they're not yet ready to make a move into the smaller companies. There are a lot of people who have some affinity with Kansas City. Maybe they grew up here, maybe they went to school here, and there's some other place, and would kind of like to come back, kind of like to raise their families here, but haven't yet sensed that now is the time for the startup scene to really take off. So they're just skeptical. But when it happens you hit a tipping point. And we saw this in Washington D.C. when we started AOL there, as I said, almost 30 years ago. It was not an entrepreneurial town. It's gotten pretty good.
Yeah.
Still work to be done, but there are now hundreds of startups and a lot of interesting things happening in a lot of different sectors. But it took this kind of sustained effort over many years.
Sure. Okay, so I have two more questions for you, and then we'll open it up to the audience for any of your questions. So the first is going back to your personal story, back to 1982. You're the manager of new pizzas at Pizza Hut. Knowing everything you know now and sort of knowing what those opportunities are out there and the way the technology has changed, what would you do with that?
With pizza?
Pizza?
No, I may tell you why I went to Pizza Hut. First of all, they offered me more money. I was 23 and I thought more money was good. They also offered me a title promotion. I thought that was good too. But the other reason was I actually love P&G and learned a lot from P&G, and some of even the intro referenced the trial strategy AOL used of sending out free discs, which I'm sure some of you got. That was really an idea that came from P&G. That's how they launched their products. If you want a new shampoo, they'd send little packets of it to you by mail or stick it in a newspaper or something. And I saw how powerful that was. So that's an example of something I learned there. I learned a lot of things there. It was a great company, but it was a top-down command and control company. And the reason I went to Pizza Hut, it was a bottom-up, essentially franchisee-controlled company. And my belief was having that perspective would be valuable. And my instinct, which proved to be right, was no matter how many smart people we thought we had in Wichita cooking up interesting new things in the R&D lab's kitchen in Wichita, most of the good ideas were going to be out somewhere else, either in franchisees doing interesting things or small or large competitors doing interesting things. And so I actually spent most of the time on the road trying to figure out how to learn from the market and then figure out which of those things could be kind of turned into products that then could be essentially done through the Pizza Hut system, which I think had like 5,000 restaurants or something like that. It was basically a bet that innovation was going to be happening on the fringes, not at the center. My belief now is that every company needs to adopt that networked, open approach to innovation, that they do have smart people, but no matter how many smart people they have within their company, I guarantee you there's more smart people outside the company and more great ideas outside the company. And building a network around your company, I think, is going to be the core management skill for this next wave. Sort of almost turning the company upside down. And there are a lot of companies that did this. In Minneapolis this week, General Mills, for example, created an open innovation labs strategy and basically trying to invite ideas in and entrepreneurs in. And they'd be the first to say, even 5 years ago, you're an entrepreneur, knocked on the door, they said, we don't even want to talk to you.
Yeah.
Our lawyers say we shouldn't even talk to you. We shouldn't, because then you'll say we stole the idea. And now they're basically, kind of turned the model upside down and are trying to build a network of innovation around the company. I think that's going to be very important. And therefore, every large company should be supporting the startup sector. It's good for the community, and they should care about that for the reason I mentioned. It probably is central to their own future because that will give them a sense of where the puck is going, and they'll be better positioned and nimbler and more innovative because they're building on the broader thinking in the world around them.
But also probably one of our greatest challenges, because that's not always easy to turn that paradigm over and flip that thinking. So very good advice. Last question. AOL screen name, what was yours?
Well, I had Steve at AOL. I had Steve C. I had Steve Cates. When you're the first user, you can kind of lock up all the good names. And I still use it, although now I use the Revolution one, because what happened with the Steve at AOL, and some of you may have known this, but every time a new user, we called them members, signed up, I would send a letter to them, an email to them, and then every month I would send updates, almost like I was the mayor of the community, here's what's happening, a letter from Steve kind of thing. And as a result, when we went from 1,000 people to tens of thousands of people, 100,000 to millions to tens of millions, at one point I think there's 30 people that just were responsible for reading and responding to my emails. It was completely overwhelmed. So I constantly had to create other accounts that I could actually use personally because my main account suddenly got co-opted.
Sure, no. Okay, let's open it up to questions. Thank you so much for being up here with us today and open for questions.